Hello guys, and welcome to this reactjs Redux persist tutorial. In this tutorial we will be creating an expense tracker, and in this expense tracker we will be displaying the balance and the income and the expenses, and we can also add a transaction, so for example the rent, and then we can put if it's or the rent is an expense, so we put minus and then whatever the expense is, so 2000. And as you can see, our expenses is minus 2000, our balance is minus 2000, and it created the transaction and it's displaying it here. And these transactions are being stored in Redux persist. So if we had just put a normal state, then when we refresh, these transactions will be deleted and the state will be empty again. But Redux persist stores it for us, and even if we refresh or we leave the page and go back to it, the transaction will still be there because it will be stored in Redux persist. So also, I know this is a replica of Traversy Media's expense tracker, if you know him, but I haven't done this with Redux persist. He used the context API, so if you refresh, all your data goes, I'm pretty sure. So I have done this with the Redux. Also, I co-own a few courses on Skillshare and Udemy, so I code and my partner talks. So the links for that will be in the description if you want to enroll in those courses. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this tutorial, and let's get started. Okay, so now let's get started. So the first thing we need to do is go to our workspace. So I'm going to go to Finder, Documents, React YouTube, and go on your workspace and right click and click New Terminal at Folder. So we can open a terminal here. If you don't have New Terminal at Folder, you can also open up your terminal and just cd into it. So you could do cd and then whatever your folder is in. My one's in documents, so cd documents, and then React YouTube, so cd React YouTube. And now to create our React app, we can do npx create React app, and then the name of the application, which is going to be expense tracker. Click enter, and that should create the React project for you. So as you can see, the project was created. So let's go ahead and open it in our code editor. You can choose any code editor you like. I use Visual Studio Code, I like it more. So go open the folder. So my one is in documents, and then React YouTube and expense tracker, and now click open. Okay, so before I explain these folders, first thing we want to do is actually start the project. Let's run it. So do npm start in your terminal. So you can just so you can open your terminal like this, or you can go up here, terminal, and then click new terminal. Npm start and then click enter. And as you can see, I have an error because some people might get this error, some people might not. So if you do get the error, create a file, call it .env. Over here you'll be storing your environment variables. So do skip preflight check, all capitals, and set that to true. And then save it and run it again, and now it should work. So it's loading the page. As you can see, now React gives us this once you create a project. So let's just delete that code for now. So we go to source app.js, and this is the code for it. So first let me explain these folders and files. So we need app.css. This is going to be for styling the components. App.test.js, I'm not going to explain that, and we don't need it. Index.css as well, logo.svg, and setup.test.js. We can delete all of these. And we're going to get some errors, so that's because we are using index.css inside index.js, so we need to delete that. And also logo.svg is being used in app.js, so we can remove that as well, and it's also being used over here. So now we're also getting some errors. No such file redirectory. We can just rerun the project. I think that'll fix it. Yeah, there we go. So the logo we did was this logo, that's why it just says logo. Okay, so these folders, we have node modules. These are all the dependencies that React installed for us when we created the project. We have public, all these files are just icons, images, and manifest.json. You can just store some data here, JSON data. Index.html is going to be the main file that renders everything. So everything is going to be rendered inside index.html. Let me just show you. So in index.js, as you can see, we are doing react.render, and we are putting our app component, which is app.js. We are importing it from /app, and we are rendering everything inside document.getElement by ID root, which is inside index.html. And as you can see, we have a div over here with the ID of root. Everything is going to be put inside here when the project is rendered. Okay, so now let's actually get started with this project. So let's remove this code inside app.js, we don't need that. And let me just close this terminal and make the code bigger. Okay, so app.css, I'm going to be putting in all the styles here. I don't want to bore you with styling, so you can get the styles from the source code. I'm going to put a link for my GitHub source code. The link is in the description. So I'm just going to remove everything and just put in all these styles that I have. And so in app.js we are importing app.css, and all our components are going to be imported into app.js, so we can use all the styles in app.css now. Okay, so now let's actually get on with the Redux part. So let's set it up. So go to your terminal, create a new terminal, and install these dependencies. So npm install Redux and React Redux and Redux persist. And also do -s and then click enter. So -s saves these into our package.json as a dependency. So sometimes you have issues and you would have to delete your node modules folder, which stores all your dependencies that you've downloaded, and you'd have to delete it and download all your dependencies again. And if you don't do -save, -s or save, then you'd have to download them one by one. Otherwise, if you have done -s, then you could just do npm install, and that would install all your dependencies again. Okay, so now let's actually set up Redux. So let's go to our source folder and make a new folder there and call it Redux. And in Redux we're going to have our store file, store.js, and also going to have reducer, so reducer.js, and also have some actions. So let's make a file called actions.js. So this will all make sense later. Right now we're just setting it up. So for store.js we're going to get some code from the documentation of Redux persist. So just search Redux persist GitHub documentation, just GitHub, and then click on the first one, and then go down, scroll down, and go to here. So we want to copy this. This code is going to be for our store.js. So go to store.js and paste all of this inside, and change this ./reducers to ./reducer because it's importing it from our reducer.js, and we only have one reducer, not reducers. So change that to reducer. And also what we want to do is remove this export default. It's exporting an arrow function that returns the store and persister, but we just want to return it like this, so we can import it as with object destructuring. So it's export it like this. So do export and then the store and export the persister as well. So okay, so now let's also set up our reducer.js. Okay, so in our reducer.js, first thing we want to do is make our initial data, or initial state. So const initial state is equal to make an array. So it's going to be equal to an object, not an array. And also want to make a arrow function. We'll call it we'll call it the expense tracker reducer, or ET reducer. So ET reducer, and this is going to be an arrow function that takes in the state, which is if it's if it's null, then we'll just set it to initial state, and also going to be taking an action, and then this is going to be an arrow function. So let's do that. Let's actually change this to expense tracker reducer. It's more neat that way. So expense tracker reducer, and so we're passing in the state, so we can use the state and change it about with our actions. And we're going to be passing an action, so we check if the person wants to add a transaction or remove a transaction. So don't worry if this doesn't make sense to you. It will make sense later when we actually do this. Right now we're just setting it up. So okay, so what we want to do is, so we want to export this expense tracker reducer. So export default expense, we'll just copy it, Ctrl C and Ctrl V. So okay, and this is being imported in our store.js, as you can see. And this root reducer, the name, it doesn't have to be the same as expense tracker reducer, because it's not doing it as object destructuring, so you can name whatever you want over here. But if you do it like this, which is object destructuring, it has to be the same name. Okay, so now let's go to our app.js. And inside app.js, what we want to do is go to our documentation. So we want to take this code, take all of it, copy it and paste it inside our app.js. Okay, so the store is going to, and the store and the persister, we're going to be importing it from store.js, as you can see, because we're exporting it. So we're exporting it inside store.js. So this creates our store and our persist store. So we want to import that and pass it into our root component, which we'll be doing later, and it will make sense later as well. So import store and persister, not capital S and P. This has to be the same name as how we are exporting it, because we are importing it as object destructuring. So persister from /redux /store. And now we'll pass it into the provider and the persister into the persist gate. We need to import these provider and persist gate. So the persist gate is being imported from Redux persist integration React. So copy that. And as for the provider, we want to import that from React Redux. So import provider from React Redux. Also provider, we have to put it in these. So, and these spaces are just for neat code. Okay, so now everything has been passed in, the persister and the store. So what we want to do now is make our main component for our transaction app. So go to source and make a new folder. And for this folder, we're going to have containers, which is going to be for our pages. We're only going to have one page for this application, but we should still have our that one page is in our containers folder, so main.js. And we're also going to have a, so first thing I want to do is make the component for this file, the main.js file. So we can do rc redux, because this is going to be a redux component. So rc redux and then click enter. And for you this won't work, because you need to install an extension, which is this ES7 React Redux GraphQL React Native Snippets. If you're not using Visual Studio Code and you don't have this extension, then just create the component like this. So just make a normal functional class component, and then import connect from React Redux and export it like this, and make these two arrow functions. So also this arrow function, the map dispatch to props, you will understand what this is later, but just for now, make it an arrow function. So pass in dispatch as well, dispatch arrow function, and this would return an object, so like that. Okay, so now we need to actually import this main.js file in the component inside app.js instead of root component. So main.js is going to be our root component for now. So we need to import this as well. So import main from /containers/main, and now it should be imported. And let's just put some text over here just so we can see. So hello, and now let's check it. We have an error, initial state is not defined in reducer.js line 5. So reducer.js initial state, we have a typo over here, so initial is spelled like this. So now let's check, initial state is not defined. So to fix that other error, just rerun the app. So do that and then npm start, and it should fix it. It fixed it for me. So as you can see, I don't have an error, I already have it open here. So now we've put some text hello in our main.js, and as you can see, it's being imported in app.js, and we are displaying it. Okay, so now let's actually get started with our expense tracker. So we want to make a components folder, so we can store our components here. And the first component we're going to have is our balance. So balance.js, and do RFC. You want to make a React functional component this time, because this isn't going to involve Redux. So the Redux part is going to be in main.js, so that's why we've done a class component. But for balance.js, we're just going to be doing a functional component. Okay, so this balance component is just going to be used to display the balance. So let's import this balance component instead of this hello. So let's import it inside our main.js, and balance. You can click enter, and that would automatically import it, and close it with like this. And if it didn't automatically import it, just import it like this. So for this balance, we want to pass in the transactions from our Redux. So to do this, so we go to reduce.js. Let's have our initial state now. So we're going to have some transactions. So that's going to be in our initial state, and this is going to be initially it's going to be set to an empty array. So transactions, sorry. And now to actually get this transactions, so as you can see, we're passing in the store and the persister into our main component, and our main component is a React class Redux component. So to actually get this, we go to map state to props, and this would so the transactions. This doesn't have to be the same name as what we did inside reduce.js, but what does have to be the same name is let's go to main.js. This, so state dot transactions. So this one has to be the same as what we called it in our reduce.js, but this one doesn't have to be. So what this does, it just changes the state to props. So now we can use our state to as props inside our main component. And let's use object destructuring to get these transactions. So const, let's put this inside render, sorry. And transactions is equal to this.props. So we are just taking transactions from this.props, and this.props contains transactions from this arrow function, which just returns this arrow function returns an object, and this object contains transactions, which is equal to state.transactions, which is being taken from our reduce.js, this initial state. Okay, so right now it's going to be an empty array, but let me just add some stuff in it. So go to reduce.js, and I'm just gonna show you. I'm just gonna have a object, and I'll just give it an ID of 1, just the object with the ID. So I can just console.log this now. So console.log transactions, just to show you that everything is working. So if I refresh now, inspect element, and console, I refresh, it's undefined. So as you can see, it's undefined because we are not returning the state in our reducer. So we need to actually return the state, so return state, and this reducer is being called in our store.js. As you can see, we have store, let store equals, so our state is being taken from create store, so this is from Redux, and we're passing in the persisted reducer. So you don't really need to understand this, but I'm just explaining it if you want to understand this. So persist reducer is being created with persist reducer from Redux persist, and this persist config is an object, and we're passing in the root reducer. And this root reducer is being taken from our reducer.js. So reducer.js is exporting this arrow function, expense tracker reducer. So we need to return the state. So and we are importing the store, which has the state now, inside app.js, and we are passing it in through the provider to our main.js component, which is a React Redux class component, and we are getting the state like this. So now if I actually console.log, as you can see, we have an array of objects, and it only contains one object with an ID, and the ID is 1 because I set that over here. So let's remove this object. We want it to be an empty array. That was just for explaining purposes. So now let's go to main.js, and we want to pass in the transactions. Let's remove this console.log too. We want to pass in the transactions to our balance, so we can calculate the balance from the transactions. So we'll do transactions and transactions. So we are passing in the transactions as props to our balance component, and we can receive these props. So if we go to balance.js, we can receive these props inside this function. Sorry. So we can receive it 3 ways. So we can receive it as props, and then we can console.log props dot whatever the props was called, so it was called transactions. And now this should also console.log just like that, okay. Or we can receive it as props, and then do object destructuring, which is the preferred way, and take transactions from props. And then now we just need to console.log transactions instead of props.transactions. Now if I refresh, it still works. And the most preferred way is I can do object destructuring, but not here, and do it over here. So I'll just do transactions. So instead of getting props and then doing object destructuring, we'll just do it over here instead. And so now if I just console.log transactions, as you can see, it's being console.logged perfectly, and it's working. So now let's move this console.log and display our transactions. And now, as you can see, we have nothing because transactions contains nothing. So what we want to do now is go through all the transactions and then get the amount of all of the sum of all of those transactions. So let's remove this. So what we want to do is go inside this functional component and do const amount is equal to transactions.map. So we want to go through all the transactions, and then this would give us the transaction by one in an arrow function or a function, whatever you want. And then, so I'm going to use the arrow function, and then we can just return transaction.amount. So when we create a transaction, we haven't actually created it right now, but when we create a transaction, we're going to have an ID and amount and also the text of that transaction, which is going to be like, for example, rent, and the amount is going to be how much the rent was, and the ID is just going to be an ID, so when we delete the transaction, we can find that transaction by its ID, and we'll have a unique ID. So right now we're just getting all the transactions and returning the transaction. Just to make this, just to explain this better, we can do it like that as a function and return transaction dot amount. So that's basically what we're doing by removing these and removing the return. It just returns it automatically, and the amount will be stored inside amount. And now what we want to do is so now we want to get the total of this amount. So let's do const total is equal to amount.reduce. So we're going to be using the reduce function from method from JavaScript, and this is just going to give us a accumulator function, so accumulation and accumulator and the amount. Or let's just call this item so it doesn't mess up with the amount that we already have. So item, and then this would be an arrow function, and it would return the accumulation, the sum already plus the item. And also this takes in the initial value of the accumulation, so 0. So basically this is going to be set to 0 at the beginning, and then we're going to be going through all the amounts, and then the item will add it to the ACC. And at the beginning it's going to be equal to 0, and we'll just add the amounts one by one. So now the total should have our total. So if I do total over here, display the total, let's check it out. It says not a number. Oh, that's because we have a empty array inside transactions. So let's actually just have some dummy data for now. So let's go to reducer.js and have just a few objects. So ID, set it to 1, text, set it to just a string with some text, and we'll give it the amount, and we'll set that for now to 10. And we have an error here. Oh, so I need to do this, a colon. And I'm just going to copy this. Wait, let me add a comma, and then I'll copy it and just paste it like 3 times, and then change the ID to 3, 4. The text, keep it the same, just mess about with these a bit. Okay, so now it should return 20 plus 10 plus 15 plus 10, which would be 55. So let me go to our Chrome, refresh. Also, let's just make sure this is a number, so I'll just wrap it inside the number, so this just makes it into a number in case it's not a number. Okay, so it says not a number because we are getting an error, and the issue is our old data has been cached. You might not get this error, but I am. So if I console.log transactions, and I refresh, as you can see, it still has that one object that has an ID of 1. So to fix this, just go to application. You might not find it here, so click on this arrows and you'll probably find application here. And we want to clear our site data, so this will delete everything we already had. So now if I close this, as you can see, we have 55, which is the sum of all the amounts of our transactions. So if I go to reducer, so 10 plus 15 plus 10 plus 20. So okay, so as you can see, it's being displayed. So what I want to do is just wrap it inside the h1, so h1, and put a dollar sign as well, and then put total. And also I just want to put a h3 and put balance. Actually I'm going to change that to h4 and make it a bit smaller, h4. So now let's go check it out. As you can see, it says balance and $55. So also I want to go to main.js and give this div a class name for styling purposes, and it will just be container. So this container class has been implemented in our app.css that you copied and pasted. So now if I refresh, as you can see, it's gone a bit to the left. Okay, so now what I want to do is actually create a transaction. So let's go ahead and create a add transaction component so we can use it in our main.js. So make a new file, call it add transaction.js, and also want to make this a React functional component, just like I explained last time. This is just going to be a functional component, and our main.js is going to be our Redux class Redux component, because we are using Redux, so we need a class component. But as for add transactions.js, we don't need the class component for this. Okay. So I want to import this add transaction inside the main.js so we can display it. So add transactions and click enter, and it will automatically import it for you. If not, import it by itself. Also want to close this, and so I'm just going to put some text. So add transaction component. Now if I save this, as you can see, it's being displayed over here. So let's remove the text and actually start with this component. So we want to have a h3, and we'll just say add transaction, and let's see how that looks. As you can see, it says add transaction, and we have this line. This is from the styling that we had in app.css. So we basically have h3, and we're changing it, so we're giving it some stuff, border bottom. So add transactions.js. Okay, so now what I want to do is actually have a form for creating a transaction, and inside this form we're going to have a div with the class name form control. I'm not going to explain these class names, just for styling so you don't get bored. So class name form control, we're going to have a label. So there's going to be a label for one of the inputs, which is the text inputs for our transaction. So he's going to be able to put in the amount and the text, and the ID will do it automatically. So yeah, so we're going to have a label text, and we're also going to have an input for the text. So input, and we're going to give this input placeholder, which is going to be enter text dot dot dot, and we're also going to have a type for this input, which is going to be equal to text. And what else? That should be it for now. Let's just see how that looks. Okay, as you can see, we have a nice input. This is all styled with our app.css. So we're going to have another one of these, so just copy paste it for our amount, and it's just going to be amount and enter amount, and instead of text it's going to be a number. We want the amount to always be a number. So now if I refresh, as you can see, now we have this. So lastly, we're going to have a button to actually submit this form. So let's go do that. So outside this div, just create a button and add transaction, and just give it a style of class btn. So class name is equal to btn, and save that. As you can see, we have now a beautiful button. Okay, so now let's work on actually adding the transaction. So when he types in the text and types in his amount and then puts in a transaction, I want to work on actually submitting that transaction to Redux persist and saving it over there. So let's go ahead and do that. So the first thing we want to do is have a state. So we're going to use the useState hook, React hook. So let's do const. We're going to have text and set text. And I'll explain this in a bit. Let's just finish this and set text, sorry. And this is going to equal to useState. And the initial value of text is going to be an empty string, and we need to import useState. useState. Okay, so basically we're just making the state is kind of like a variable for this component, and so this is going to be the state text, and we're going to have set text, which would be a function to change this text, change the value of this text. And whatever we put inside here, which we put empty string, is going to be the initial value of text. So we want to link this text to the input of text, so value equals text. Because later on when the user clicks the button and then submits the form, what we want to do is we're going to set the text back to an empty string, and we also want the input to be back to nothing, the value of it. So we're just going to put the value text, and this will all make sense when we actually add the transaction, so don't worry if this doesn't make sense right now. Okay, so what we want to do now is if you've actually installed this extension that I told you about, the ES7 React Redux, then you can do Option Shift F to make the code neater for MacBook, and if you're using Windows, then you can do Alt Shift F. Okay, so now for this form on submit, so we can check if the form has been submitted using the button, and then we just want to call a function called onSubmit, and let's actually create this function. So we're getting an error because onSubmit is not defined, so let's do that. So const onSubmit, I'm going to make it an error function, so equals error function, and we'll be receiving an event. So so the form, when we do onSubmit, it will automatically pass the submit event to our function. So this is going to be an error function, and we want to do event.prevent default. That's the first thing we want to do. So what this does is when we submit a form, it automatically refreshes the page. So and it does some other stuff as well, the default stuff. So we just want to prevent those, and we want to do our own stuff. So when he submits this form, we want to get to the text that he put and the amount, and we want to create an object with that and set it in the state, and then we'll add the transaction using Redux. So let's go ahead and do that. So the first thing we want to do is create the object. So const new transaction is equal to an object, and this object would have an ID, which for now I'm just going to set it to 0, just for now. And we're also going to have some text, and that text is going to be equal to the text inside the state, so our text state, and the value would be basically the same value as the input. So text is equal to text. So when the input changes, we want to change the text as well, so let's actually do that. So onChange, so we'll do onChange on the input, and we'll do an arrow function, and we'll receive the event of the onChange, and we'll do set text, so we'll change the text based on the input value, and we can get the value from this event doing event.target.value. You can console.log event if you want, and you can see what it contains, but if you don't want to, you can just do event.target.value, and that has the value of the input. So text is now going to be the value of the input. We also want amount, so let's actually do that now. So amount, so we need to do the same thing for our amount input. So let's give it a value of which is equal to amount. So we need to actually create this amount state. I didn't do that. So const amount, and then set amount as well to set the amount, and use state. And initially we're going to set it as 0, so the amount is going to be 0. Sorry, I have two S's here. I'm going to remove one. And so the value is going to be amount. I have an error because I haven't set amount. Okay, so the value is going to be amount, and on change, so when the value of the input changes, we want to pass in the event to arrow function, and do the same thing as we've done with the text. So we'll do set amount, and then pass in event.target.value. And now we want to set the amount to amount from state. Okay, so let's console this new transaction. So we're not actually adding a transaction right now, we're just creating an object for that transaction. So let's just see how it looks. So new transaction, and let's see if it actually works. So let's inspect element, open our console. Now let's put some text, put some amount, and as you can see we have this object with the ID and text and amount. So for the ID, we want it to be the last transaction's ID plus 1. So each ID has its unique ID. So a lot of people just do math.random and do it like from 0 to 1 million, so they just get a random ID, but that's not really right. So we want to actually get, so each one has a unique ID. So let's go to main.js, and to add transactions we want to pass in ID. So this ID is going to be equal to transactions. So first we want to check if there's transactions. So transactions 0. Let's check if the first element is there. So what we're going to do is when we add a transaction, we're going to add it at the beginning of the array. So the first transaction of the transactions array is going to be the one with the newest one, which is going to be the one with the biggest ID, and we just want to increment that by 1. So first we're checking if there is a transaction. If there is, then we want to do transactions 0, so the first one, which has the biggest ID, dot ID, plus 1. And that would be our new ID. Otherwise, if there is no transactions, then the ID is going to be 1. So it's basically, if there's no transactions, then this is our first transaction, and our first transaction is going to have the ID of 1. So let's receive this ID in our add_transactions component. So just like I told you, you could do props and then props.id or object destructuring. So I'm just going to do object destructuring, so ID, and now instead of 0, we're going to actually have an ID. So now let's refresh this. So we already have, okay, so let's refresh this. SS. So right now we have nothing in Redux persist. Well, actually no, we do have 4 stuff. We have 4 transactions. So we're meant to actually make the one with ID 4 at the beginning, because that's how it's going to be done. So we're going, so basically it's just going to get the first one with the ID 1 and increment 1 right now. But when we actually add the transaction with the Redux, and we don't have dummy data, we have real data, the ID 4 is going to be at the top, and ID 1 is going to be at the bottom, and it will take the ID 4 and increment 1. But right now ID 1 is the first one, so it's going to actually give us an ID of 2, as you can see. So right now this would be an issue, but this is just dummy data, and when we actually implement it, the ID 4 is going to be at the top, and it will take the 4 and add 1, so it would be 5, and each one would have a unique ID. If this doesn't make sense, don't worry, it would actually make sense when we create the add transaction action in Redux and we actually implement adding a transaction. So let's finish this off. So after creating a transaction, we want to, okay, so now we're going to do that part with Redux. So we want to actually add a transaction to Redux. So to do this, we need to go to our Redux folder and go to actions.js. So we want to create a new actions. So let's do const, make this capitals now, and do add_transaction, 1s, sorry, and copy this, and this equals to a string with the same thing. So you will see why we're doing this right now. So we're going to have const add transaction, const add transaction, like that, and this equals to an arrow function, and this arrow function will take in the transaction, so transaction, and we're going to be returning an object, sorry, so let's actually do that. So do that and then return an object, and then this object is going to contain an action and the payload. So the action is going to be equal to the add transaction, so add transaction. So you could just put a string of add transaction, but this is better. It's better to do it this way. So I want to export this as well, and export this. So yeah, so action add transaction. You could just put a string, like I said, add transaction, but it's better to actually store this string inside the const and then use it over here. And also the payload is going to be the transaction that is being passed in, so the transaction itself. Okay. And Redux and in Reducer we'll be receiving this action, as you can see. So now that we're receiving this action, we have many actions. We're going to have many actions, so we're going to need a switch function. So switch, and the switch is going to be based on the action, and then we're going to have case add transaction, which we're going to import right now from add transactions. From actions.js. So we imported it automatically, and if this is the case, then we want to actually implement the add transaction function. So let's do that. But first I just need to fix something, so we're going to do it based on action.type, and in actions.js this is not going to be action because this object is going to be the action, and this would be the type of the action. So sorry about that. We need to fix that. And now, so the type, if the type is actually a transaction, then we want to add a transaction. And then we want to get a copy of the state, and then a transaction. We want to change now the value of transactions, which is from our initial state. So we want to do, first thing we want to do is do this, colon, and then we'll have an array. But we need to actually return this, so let's return this first. So return as an object, Control V, So basically, okay, I'll explain later. But dot state, and then so returning a copy of the state plus the transactions, and the transaction is going to be an array of the action.payload. So I'll show you what this is. So action.payload is the payload as over here. So as you can see, we have payload, and the payload is set to the transaction that is being passed in that we want to add. So action.payload, and we also want to do state dot transactions. So dot state dot transactions. So remember how I said that the transaction will be added at the beginning of the array. This would be the newest transaction, and it would have the biggest ID. So we can just add 1 to that. So this is what I mean. We're passing the transaction at the beginning of the array, and then putting the rest of the state over here. So okay. So now that we can actually add a transaction, and we are returning the full state now. We want to have a default case. So default is just going to be returning a state. So if we're not actually having a action, then we just want to return the state. So do that, return state. And now in add transactions.js. So main.js is our Redux component. So we need to change this action to a prop over here. Map dispatch to props. So we'll do add transaction. And you can name this whatever you want, but I'm going to call it as add transaction, and this would be equal to an arrow function which would take in the transaction, and then would dispatch our add transaction function inside our actions.js. We're going to dispatch this, so we go to add transaction main.js, and we'll dispatch add transactions. So import that. It automatically imported it for me. Otherwise, import it for yourself if it didn't. So import it like this, and I want to pass in the transaction. So basically, we have an error. Transactions is not defined. Oh, sorry, transaction, not transactions. Okay, so basically we are we're getting the function from Redux, the action, and making it into a prop for this component so we can use it. Just like we did for the state. So this is an arrow function that would dispatch the add transaction function, and it would pass in the transaction. So this add transaction function is from our actions.js, as you can see over here, and we are passing in the transaction, and we are receiving it over here and passing it in as payload. The type is add transaction, and this action will be passed into Redux over here. We are getting it over here, and we are checking the case add transaction. So if it is add transaction, then we would create the transaction basically now. So now if I go to main.js, now we have the add transaction. So we want to do object destructuring and receive it as props as well, just like we did with the state, because this does map dispatch to props, so it changes the actions to props for us now. And we want to pass in this add transaction to our add transactions component. So paste it in here, and when we call this prop and add transactions, we'll be passing in the transaction, and we'll be calling our add transaction function, this one from Redux, and we'll pass in the transaction. You can just do it like this. So remove all this and just do add transaction and call the function, but just this makes more sense so you can understand it. So we'll be receiving the transaction from the add transaction, let me just show you right now. So we're going to receive this as props, the function add transaction, so like that, and then we'll call it over here add transaction, and we'll pass in our new transaction. So new transaction. So we're calling the add transaction, passing our transaction, and then going to main.js. As you can see, we're here. When it is passed in, we'll receive it as transaction, call the add transaction action from Redux, and pass in our transaction, and then Redux would receive that and return an object with the type, which is a transaction, and the payload as our transaction, and then in the reducer would receive the action and would actually create the transaction. So now we can delete this dummy data because we don't need it. So this is going to be an empty array, and now let's refresh. This is still $55. So our data has been cached. So let's go to application and storage and clear site data, and now if we refresh, as you can see now it's 0 because we have nothing in transactions. So basically our data was cached. So now let's actually add the transaction. what I want to do is actually console.log the transactions, because we're not actually displaying it right now. Or actually no, the balance will change, so we don't need to do that. So make a new transaction, for example, rent, and the amount will be $20, for example, and then add transaction. As you can see, it was meant to be minus 20 because rent is minus, it's expense, not income, but this is just for testing purposes, and as you can see, the balance has changed to $20. So if I just add now rent minus 40, so rent number 2, for example, and then minus 40, this should change to minus 20. As you can see, the balance is now minus 20. So now that we can add transactions, we need to actually display these transactions so the user can see it and he can remove it if he added it by mistake. So to do this, we're going to have a transaction list component. So let's go to our components and make a new component, and we'll call it transactions. Let's make it plural, transactions list.js, and we'll do RFC, React Functional Component. And for this transactions list, we're going to receive the transactions from Redux so we can display them one by one. So let's go to main.js. We need to display this transactions list. So we'll do it before that transactions form. So transactions list, transaction, so we can automatically import it. If it doesn't, it will import it by itself. And okay, so we want to pass in the transactions just like we did with the balance. But for the balance, we checked the amount and got the sum of the amounts, all of them, and displayed it. But this time we're just going to be displaying the transactions. So we'll just pass in the transactions that we're receiving from the state, from Redux state. And now in transactions list.js, we would receive this like with object destructuring and transactions. So now we are receiving the transactions. Let's actually display this. So we're going to have a h3 first, which is just going to say transactions. And what we're going to have is a unordered list. So this is HTML element, and we're just going to give it a class name. And that class name is list. This is just a class from our app.css. So now inside this unordered list, for each transaction we want to display it inside this list. So it's going to be a list of our transactions. So let's open up these and do transactions.map, and then we're going to receive a transaction and arrow function, and we want to return the transaction. So we need the transaction component now. So let's just use the transaction for now over here, and we need to make a transaction component in our components. So this is basically undefined right now. So let's make this. So transaction.js, transaction, not transactions, sorry, and RFC, React Functional Component. And for now, I'm just going to say, oh, actually, I'll leave it empty for now. So add transactions, transactions list, and we'll pass in a key. Otherwise, you'll get error. We need a key, which is going to be the transaction.id. Though the error wouldn't be like, it would be a warning, I think. So it's not really important, but if you want to remove that warning, just pass in the key. And then, so each each transaction is going to have its own key, a unique key. And then we want to pass in the transaction itself so we can display it. So transaction, and then we'll receive the transaction inside transaction.js. So let's do that. So transaction, not capital C, and then let's just display this transaction. We'll display the transaction.text for now, because remember we have text for this transaction, or we have ID, or we have amount. So okay, so now let's actually see this. So if I save this, transaction is not, oh, I need to import transaction inside our transactions list, because we are using the component here but it's not imported. So import from /transaction. So now if I save this, as you can see, we have our transactions being displayed over here. So we just want to make this a bit nicer and display the amount as well. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's go ahead and style this component. So let's remove this div, and we're going to have it as a list item, because remember in the transactions list we have an unordered list, and inside the unordered list we have many list items. So let's have a list item tag. And this list item is the class is going to be, so the styling of it is either going to be red or green. So we're going to change it red or green based on the transaction amount, if it's minus or plus. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll do transaction.amount. So we're checking the amount. If it's more than 0, then so we'll do the question mark, and then if it is more than 0, then we would show the plus class, which is inside app.css, is just some styling. And otherwise, we'll be displaying the minus class, which is also some styling. So if the transaction amount is bigger than 0, which means it is positive, then we'll do plus, otherwise we'll do minus, which means it's negative, or 0. So, okay. So actually we want to check if it's bigger than or equal to 0, then we'll do plus, because 0 is not really minus, but also 0 is not positive, but I'd just rather do it as plus. So, okay. So let's go ahead and now display the transaction text. So let's do that. So transaction.text. And then after that, we want to display the transaction amount. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll have a span. And then we'll display, so we want to display a plus or minus, a minus based on the transaction amount. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll just have a variable over here. We'll call it sign. And this variable would be equal to either plus or minus, a string which is either plus or minus based on the amount, just like we did over here, but instead of giving it a class, we'll either do plus or minus. So we'll do transaction.amount, and then we'll check if transaction.amount is bigger than 0, and if it is bigger than 0, that means it's positive, so we'll do plus, bigger than or equal to 0, let's just do, and otherwise we'll do a minus. So now let's go ahead and display the sign before the transaction amount, and then we'll also display the transaction amount now. So before we display the transaction amount, we want to have a dollar sign because it's going to be in dollars, and then we'll display the transaction amount. So we'll do math.abs, so absolute, which doesn't, so if the number is like 2.67, it won't round it up, we'll just display it as 2.67. So now we'll do transaction amount, we'll pass it in. And then now we are displaying the text and the amount. Let's just go check this out now, how it looks. So as you can see, it looks beautiful. So it's red because this is minus and this is positive, so it's showing green. This is the class that we've done over here inside the list item. So it's based on the transaction amount. So now let's have a button for deleting the transaction. So I'm going to create a button after this span button, and the class name is going to be delete button, because this button is for deleting, and I have made this class inside app.css. So it's going to be delete button, and we're just going to have a capital X inside it. Okay, so now when the user clicks this button, we want to delete the transaction. So we'll do onClick, and we need to pass in we want to create a delete transaction action now inside Redux. So let's go ahead and do this. So we'll copy this, paste it, and we'll do, instead of add, we'll do delete. Capital, sorry, and we'll copy this and paste it here, and we need to copy this as well and make a new one and do delete transaction, and also pass in the transaction type. Is not going to be add transaction now, it's going to be delete transaction, and also the payload would be the transaction. Actually we'll be receiving the ID of the transaction, so just call it transaction ID, and we'll copy this, paste it here. Okay, so now that we've created the action, we want to actually do it. If the action is delete transaction, or if the action type is delete transaction over here, so then we'll delete the transaction. So we want to check case delete transaction, which is we just automatically imported from /actions, which is the action that we just created right now. So we're checking if the type is delete transaction, then we want to actually delete the transaction. So if the case is if the action type is delete transaction, then we want to delete the transaction. So we want to return a copy of the state, so return state, and all of this would be put inside the object. So a copy of the state, and then we want to change the value of transactions. So the transactions, and we want to filter the transactions. We want to remove the transaction with the ID that has been passed in. So we'll do transactions.filter. Sorry, state.transactions. I want to get the transactions from state, and then we'll filter them, and it will give us the transaction one by one. So transaction arrow function, and then if the transaction.id, so transaction.id is not equal to the action.payload, which is going to be the ID of the transaction we want to delete, then we'll return the transaction, and then it will be set inside transactions. And we'll do this for each one. It will check if the ID is not equal to this, then which is the ID that we want to delete, then we'll return it inside transactions. So basically all of them would be returned other than the one we want to delete. So let's save this, and now we can go to main.js and want to dispatch this to props. this delete transaction. So we'll do delete transaction, and this would be an arrow function, and we'll receive the ID, sorry, not transaction, and we'll dispatch the delete transaction action. So enter, and that would automatically import it from Redux actions, and then we'll pass in the ID to this delete transaction. So now we have set this delete transaction action, we have set it up. Now we want to pass it into the transactions list. So let's actually pass it in as props. So delete transaction is equal to, we need to get this transaction with the object destructuring, so delete transaction, and then so when we pass it in, we want to receive an ID, and then we'll call the delete transaction. So we'll pass in the ID, which is this delete transaction, which is being received as props over here, and this would be called, and we'll pass in the ID, and it would do what we just done in the reducer. So now in transactions list we are receiving the delete transaction. So now we are receiving the delete transaction, and now we want to do the same thing as we've done inside main.js, because we want to pass in this delete transaction to the actual transaction. So delete transaction is equal to the same thing as we've done. We'll receive the ID, and then we'll call the delete transaction function and to pass in the ID. Let me just clean this code, just like I said, Option Shift F or Alt Shift F if you're on Windows, if you have installed the extension, this one. And okay, so let's go back to our transactions list. And so now we're passing in the delete transaction. So now inside the transaction.js, we also want to receive the delete transaction prop, and then we'll do the same thing as we've done with the add transaction. We just want to call this. So on the click of this delete button, we want to call an arrow function, and then we'll call this delete transaction function, and we'll pass in the transaction ID. So transaction.id. Okay, so let me just explain this again. So when I did Option Shift F, this came up. I'm just going to delete it. We don't need it. So let me just explain again what's going to happen. So this transaction, each transaction has a delete button. When you click on it, it calls this delete transaction and passes in the ID of the transaction, which passes it into our transactions list, which receives it and then passes it also delete transaction and passes in the ID, and this is passed into the main.js, and the main.js receives the ID and also passes it into the delete transaction function from Redux, and then the Redux dispatches this delete transaction and passes in the ID, and then would receive it over here. The ID would be set as payload, and the type would be delete transaction, and then the reducer would be returning the state and would filter the transactions based on the ID. So now let's actually see if this works. So let's go to our Chrome, and now we have this delete button. So if I click this, as you can see, it has been deleted and the balance has been updated as well. So now I want to show the income and the expense of the person's transactions. Well, okay, so let's actually do this. So let's create a new component and call it income expense. So income expense .js, and we'll do RFC to create a React functional component, because this doesn't involve Redux, so we don't really need a class component. So let's go to main.js and let's import this income expense. We'll do it above the transactions list. So we'll do income expense, and then it will automatically import it for us. And let's close this. And all we need to do is we're going to be checking the income and checking the expense inside the component. So we'll just pass in the transactions, so we can check it over there. So transactions, and then if we go to income expense, we can receive this with object destructuring. So transactions. Just like I said, you can receive it as props and then do props.transactions, or receive it as props and do object destructuring over here, or you can just do object destructuring over here. Okay. Okay, so when we're done with this application, we just need to finish up this component. So let's go ahead and do that. So we need to, first I'm going to actually display the HTML stuff. So for this div, before I actually split them up into income and split the transactions up to expense and receive the expense and the income. So let's actually do this. So class name, this is a style that I have. So let's do inc so income and expenses. So we'll just do inc exp container. That's what I've called it. So just do that, and then we'll have a div for the income and a div for the expenses. So let's do the income first. So h4, and this would say income, and then we're going to have a paragraph this is going to be for the actual income, how much it is. For now, I'm just going to put like a dummy data. So class name, I'm going to give it some styling, which is money plus. So money and then plus. The plus is for green, and the money is some styling. And okay, so inside here we would put the income, but for now I'm just going to put some dummy data. So I'm just going to put like 10 plus 10, for example, and plus $10 actually. And I'm going to copy this div for the expenses as well. So expense is okay. So expenses, and then we'll have money minus, not money plus, and we'll just do minus $10 instead of plus. Okay, so now let's see how this looks. So as you can see, it's looking very nice. We just need to replace these with the actual income and the actual expense. So right now the income is actually 0 and the expense is minus 40. So let me delete this. So now they should all be 0. As you can see, the balance updated. So I'll add the income and add some transactions later. For now, actually, I'll just add some right now. So the rent is going to be an expense. So I'll do minus, for example, 1,000, and that will do minus $1,000 and the rent. And for income, I'll do, for example, job, and let's say I received $3,000, and add that as transaction, as income. Okay, so now the income should be 3,000 and the expense should be minus 1,000, and the balance is 2,000 because 3,000 plus minus 1,000 is $2,000. So now let's calculate the income and calculate the expenses. Okay, so over here, let's have a const for income. So const income is equal to. So for the income, what I want to do is first I want to get the amount actually. So const amount, just like we done with the balance, I think. Yes, the balance. Let's remove this constant log. Actually, I don't need this. So just like I done here, I'm gonna copy this. Sorry, go to income expense. And actually, let's delete this part. Okay, so there we go. So I'll explain this again. So the amount is going to be equal to, we're going to loop over all the transactions, and then we'll just return the transaction amount. So the amount would pretty much be an array of the transaction amounts. Okay, so now the income is going to be equal to the amount.filter. So we're going to filter all the amounts, and we'll just get the ones that are bigger than 0, because they are positive and they are the income. So amount.filter, and we'll receive them as items, and then item, so item, and then we'll filter it based on, so if item is bigger than 0, then it will be returned item, yeah, so because this item is the amount. And now after I filter them, so now I have all the amounts that are positive, so they are the income amounts. After that, I want to add them all up, so I want to do dot reduce, and just like we did inside balance, we added up all the amounts. Now I just want to add up the income, the filtered ones. So I'll do reduce, and then arrow function, the ACC, and then the item, and this would be an arrow function, and we'll return the ACC plus the item. So, and then the initial value of the ACC would be 0. We want to start off from 0. I did Option Shift F to make this code neater, or Alt Shift F for Windows. And now I want to do the same thing for the outcome. The expenses, not outcome. So paste this, Option Shift F. This is going to be expenses, and instead of item is bigger than 0, this time it's going to be smaller than 0, and the rest is going to stay the same. So now if I replace this with expenses, and replace this with income, Option Shift F to make it neater. Also the income is going to be plus and then $sign, so the income plus which is dollars, and then plus, which is because it's plus, and for the expenses minus and $sign as well. So let's save this and see how it looks. So as you can see, our expenses is minus 1,000 and our income is 3,000. Actually, we don't need this minus that I had added, so we can remove that. Now if I save this, because we already have a minus over here, so minus $1,000. So I hope you've enjoyed this project. Please like and subscribe. Thank you.